Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show, and thanks so much for tuning in again. And we are getting towards the end of our series on the illusion of free choice, a return to mastering our own life. And again, this series would not be complete unless we brought back our good friend Jiulio Consiglio. And Julio has been on the show with us many times. I think the first one we had was episode 119, where we talked about the healing frequency to open your third eye. We had him back on episode 129 because he was actually right in Ottawa, and we called it Freedom Truck Convoy Ottawa Boots on the Ground with Julio. And then we more recently had him on episode 135. Are you creating your life consciously? Or are you allowing outside circumstances to choose it for you? And so we've had him on a number of our series because we really love Julio. I mean, just as a person, we've just absolutely adored Julio. And he's got such brilliant insights into things, and we really love to hear his perspective on just about any concept or any of the series that we run. We like to run them by Julio and see where it sits for him too. Julio's an author. He's a spiritual teacher. He's written a number of books: The Healing Frequency, Open Your Third Eye. I think your first one, Challenge Your Thoughts, and most recently, this one called Cosmic Contact. Spiritual insights into triangular UFOs, extraterrestrial communication, and encounter preparation that I want to talk about as well. And Julio just has this really beautiful way of pulling back in the transformative power of inner stillness, mind-body connection, and awakening our innate psychic abilities. So, Julio, welcome to the show again.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here, and hi, Tia. I'm so happy
Hi,
to be here.
Julio.
Yeah, it's always fun. Like I was saying, we were talking earlier, so it's really like talking to a brother whenever we get to talk to you, Julio. So we've been following a lot of the stuff you've been talking about the last while related to cosmic contact, which we will get into in a little bit because I think I mean, it's a really fascinating piece right now. So much conversation around just the concept of UFOs, so many more people talking about them and sightings of them. So we'll get your perspective on that in just a bit. What I'd love to tie in, because the series is around free choice, and I want to get your perspective on that. But maybe we can start by getting some definitions down so that everybody's sort of on the same page as we're going through. You mentioned in one of your books, spirituality is universal. Can you define what you mean by spirituality?
To me, spirituality is living moment by moment with the awareness of knowing who you are and where you are. So you can't know where you are until you first realize who you are. So we've been conditioned, the masses, the entire collective, that we are our thoughts, that we are our ego and our physical body. But when you awaken to the reality of inner stillness and understand the transient nature of the thinking mind, that's when you now spirituality doesn't become or isn't theory. It's now direct experience and knowing. And when you know who you are in source energy, or if you want to use the word God, then you realize the kingdom is within and it is also without. So spirituality to me is active. It's not based in thought. It's not based in emotion. It's operating through that pure awareness of beingness and realizing you're one with everything. And then from that perspective, from that vantage point, you then approach life with greater clarity.
This is why we keep bringing you back, Julio, for these types of
Thank you.
insights. And that's why we had you on this series, Know Thyself, because that is such a foundational piece of all of this process. I love that right now. It's like this concept of like, kind of like practical spirituality. It's not conceptual anymore. It's like, how do we actually have the experience of it? I remember talking to Dr. Irvin Laszlo a long time ago in a Mind Body series, and he wrote a book called Reconnecting to Source. And he talked about the importance of spiritual experience for pretty much exactly the same reason you mentioned it. It's through that experience that you have this tangible knowing that then just blows the boundaries off of what your perceptions of life and everything was prior to that experience. So it's why it's so hard to try and nail it down. and it's different for everybody because it's unique and it's individual. It's your own experience and your own knowing that comes up with it. So beautiful. You mentioned stillness in that. What is the overlay of stillness tied in with spirituality?
So stillness is a reflection of our inner being. And inner stillness is not an idea. It's not sort of part of imagination. It is, it simply is. It is within and without. So when you're operating through inner stillness, there's no thought. You're transcendent. And when you're transcendent of the thinking mind, you're now allowing clarity, wisdom, insight. And if we want to talk about psychic abilities, in inner stillness, you actually are in a non-resistant state. And then you realize your psychic abilities actually have a consciousness of their own. And us being like source want to extend that. And these potentialities within us want to express themselves. So it's simply being out of the way, shifting beyond the ego and allowing the authentic self, which is limitless in every way, to express itself freely.
Beautiful. Julio, can you define ego for us as well while we're at it?
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not going to really tiptoe around this. So the ego, it is that automatic thinker. And I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with it. And before making a shift in consciousness, it actually is a source of suffering. After making a shift, it becomes contrast to our inner light of stillness. But what I want to say about the ego is it is that automatic thinker that we take on as human beings. But it is also sort of a possessive entity. And when I say that, we have to add light to this. It's simply attachment. So whatever you are attached to essentially has attached itself to you. So the ego, in essence, is attachment, and its core essence is fear and separation. So it convinces us that we're separate from source and separate from each other, and ultimately really separate from life. So that is the egoic mind in a nutshell, operating always between past and future, never wanting to realize the present moment, because to realize the present moment would be the beginning of the end of the egoic mind.
So then what's the role of the ego then? Is there a beneficial role for the ego in our regular life? Or is it just is there only a role for it in a certain level of consciousness and then not so much of a role for it if we move up in consciousness? Or so I guess, is there a purpose for the ego then? And how do we start to put it into its rightful place?
Absolutely. So, understanding what the ego is from a spiritual point of view, its sole purpose is the bringer of light. It's the darkness that creates that suffering and that desire, and in some cases, that white hot desire to seek the light within us. So, it serves that purpose, that it's that catalyst that makes us seek. Without that separation, without that experience of knowing us being separate from source, then we couldn't fully realize and understand what it is like to be one with source. And as I mentioned earlier, before making the shift, especially in my case, it was a tremendous source of suffering. After making the shift, it still serves a purpose because it offers you contrast, it offers you sort of a choice. Do I want to go here or do I want to go there? And ultimately, it is that which is to show you what stillness is, in the sense that without knowing that darkness, without experiencing that past and future, you couldn't have that full understanding and realization of the eternal moment of now.
What you're saying makes me think of some reading that I've been doing, excuse me, with Guy Needler's content. He actually spoke about Lucifer, I think, and his role in actually pitching this idea to source and origin for the separation to be created. And when you're speaking of ego, is this something that Lucifer essentially created in order to have the experience of separation from source and origin?
The truth is, and I've written about this in the healing frequency, the ego is Lucifer. The ego is the darkness. So we need to sort of shift past this idea that that Lucifer is some negative being with a pitchfork and a tail. It's simply negative energy. If you even look at the word Satan, saying anything as negative, or so it's simply the darkness or the contrast. And I have to really say this, it's illusory in nature. When I say it's illusory, it is, look at its fleeting nature and look at the way it changes, like the wind. So we have to really come into the understanding and knowing who we are relative to source. There's no separation. We are powerful, creative beings. So just imagine, being a limitless being in the quantum field. What kind of challenges would we have to lay before us in order to remember who we are? So we created this false self. Does it matter what we call it? Ultimately, no. But if we want to add clarity, if you want to really bring light to it, not tiptoe around it, that's essentially what the ego is.
I really needed to hear it like that. That just made so many sense on so many different levels. Like RJ also spoke of the ego, and you don't even actually want to negotiate with it. It's essentially a parasite. You just tell it to get in the back seat, and that your higher self is running this incarnation. Oh, thank you. That just brought so much clarity.
Well, I like that too, because I feel like so much of this stuff where it gets heated and confusing for people too is I feel like so much religiosity gets in there, and it's got so much, there's so many images that come up that people then kind of lock onto. And I very much feel the same way around this, is these are just sort of energies and experiences that we have. And if we are connecting more and more to what is ultimately true, then the rightful place for these other things, I guess, just automatically arises because we know where they are and we know what's true.
I would also add this, I think it's important, is we could also look at this almost from a physics or quantum field point of view. So if we look at the atom, we have the neutron, so we can say that's stillness, neutral. We have the proton, which is the positive or conscious self. And then the electron, the ego, the negative charge. What happens at the moment of awakening and enlightenment is you actually cast out that ego. And when it's cast out, you now come into balance. And what it happens is it just orbits around. So what happens is it's now on the surface of the mind orbiting, but it's no longer attached to you. So now you're free, you're liberated, and you experience it and you see it for what it is, the dreaming state or 3D consciousness.
That's a really neat way to put it, because the electron's what holds the charge.
Exactly.
Right? So you're getting rid of the charge and coming back to like back to a neutrality.
You're casting it out. I really should underline the power of inner stillness, especially, if I really want to just spend a few seconds on it, is when that force is activated in you, and that third eye is activated, you will not have to do anything. The power, the all-consuming fire that is inner stillness will literally consume it and shut it down as negativity arises. That's the surrendered state.
Yeah, that's actually reminds me of the way, even what I love to see is when we talk to different people, what I'm always curious to see is, where do I feel like there's the overlaps? Because I really do feel like that's where the universal truths lie. And so this is why sometimes we have these conversations. We even ask similar types of questions because I'm wanting to hear what comes up, and I'm feeling out where do they overlap. And so even with teachings from Jacqueline Hobbs with Oracle Girl, she would talk about, from that place of embodied pure love, anything that would be quote unquote negative literally burns up in the flames of it. It can't touch you.
RJ also spoke recently about real love actually disintegrates and dismantles anything that is not of itself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It consumes it. And when you're in, I've been operating with this awareness for several years now, and it's now essentially the ego absolutely has just been completely dismantled. So it just appears, you observe it. What you look at, especially with unconditional love and non-reaction, is what disappears. So it's observing. I should remind everyone, it's the reaction that fuels it. And what is reaction? It's coming from a space of not fully trusting yet. So when you fully trust, when that faith has been cultivated, you realize, no, I'm not going to react to this. And there's not even a dialogue. You simply look at it. It's like a dream, and it just dissolves instantly. It doesn't even have the opportunity to become a negative emotion. So people are like, well, don't you feel? Yes, what you feel is the unconditional love of beingness and the peace that comes with it. So, stillness in one sense is empty, but again, it's teeming with just, expressions of unconditional love.
So this is almost what you're describing as like this equanimity that is present within you. How is that cultivated? And for those of us who have touched it before within, the spiritual experience, within meditation, or, the aha that happens in nature, or connecting with a baby or a child, how is it maintained?
So it's maintained by a few ways. It's remembering the present moment and remembering that the past and future are only mind constructs. There's really no reality to them relative to the eternal moment of now. When you really recognize that everything that has happened and will happen is taking place in this one holy instant, then you realize that is just simply thoughts. They're simply thoughts. And our reality is created within our consciousness. So it's understanding that the present moment is all there ever is. Also, and this is very important, I actually put a post on Instagram about this earlier, is challenging negative thinking. So when an automatic negative thought arises, you have that choice. Do you react or do you observe it? As you observe it and get into the practice of observing it, you're not now fueling it with your vital energy. So what eventually happens is it starts losing its grip on your consciousness and dies within your consciousness. And then by choosing the opposite, positive or conscious thought, you now move forward. So for example, the automatic negative thought comes in and says, I feel stuck, I'm never going to move ahead. You observe it instead of reacting. So you've now diffused it. And when you use the phrase I am, you're not saying I will be, it's I am now. I am already moving forward. So that's how you begin to align. When you start using conscious thinking like that with the I am, you are aligning more and more with the third eye. And as you do that, you are actually shifting from potential to possibility to a spontaneous awakening where the third eye is actually activated. And I'll underline this is you cannot mistake the activation of the third eye with anything else. At that moment, you will absolutely know it's been activated. There's no subtlety to it.
Can you give an example of using the I am statements for people? What would be something that they could practice in regards to that to assist that process?
Absolutely. So I am whole and complete. I am healed. I am strength. I am renewed challenges that negative thought that I'm always tired. So it is choosing consciously from the soul's perspective what you want and what you want now. So it's phrases like that, or I am strength. I am powerful. I am not a body. You're now shifting from the 3D perspective to higher dimensions of thinking. And that's what aligns one more and more to that sixth consciousness, that sixth chakra consciousness. So it's thoughts like that are actually expressions of the soul and not the egoic mind.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I like those
Yeah.
exercises. That would be a good practice for people at home. I would literally make probably like a list of what are the challenges that come up, especially if we pay attention, even for like a few hours of just writing down what is going on. You'll start to see the patterns that we have the same limiting thoughts that typically surface over and over and over again. If we can pay attention to that and then put down an I am statement to literally dismantle that, and use that as a bit of an anchor, that probably would be really beneficial to just use those. And then through the practice of it, we're basically activating those neural networks to start to get online and become the default.
Does it need to be believable, or is it a process in allowing it to be believable at some point?
Well, you will, with practice and with trust and faith, so cultivating faith and trust, it actually will eventually become a knowing. So you really, you want to say it, but you want to say it with a knowingness. You want to say it with a knowingness that what I desire for my life is what Source or God desires for me. So again, it's tearing down those walls of separation and realizing Source is within, and Source is more than ready to offer us that which we desire. We just have to align with the mind of Source, which is that dimension of inner stillness.
Beautiful. I feel like this is a great way to even hop into the illusions of free choice. Julio, from your perspective, how has religion hijacked our ability to be able to realize what you're speaking of, where Source is truly within and not this other figure that we basically praise and worship outside of us?
The first thing I'll say is it is nothing more than a stepping stone. So it is theory, and the only thing it really has given us is an idea that there does exist a creator. But what it is you have people that have not made that shift, that are constantly looking to the past, that are looking to theory, and that have convinced the masses that Source or God is outside of us. And that has created that narrative, and that is what is separated humanity from their divinity, from oneness, from the reality of oneness. So the only purpose it serves is to give you an awareness that there does exist a creator, but where it falls completely is how it always is looking to the past, not looking to the spontaneity of the soul, that all things and everything is possible. The Bible has some real nice nuggets of truth when the master says, you do not know how to examine the present moment. That is like, you know, you will change in the twinkling of an eye. Christ is talking about the third eye there.
Mm.
So there are nuggets, but for the most part, like everything else, history is his story. It's coming from someone else. It's been watered down. And this is every religion essentially. So you need to, if you want to really truly heal your life and shift and have a direct experience with Source, with God, is you have to transcend that and let go of the fear of the unknown, because it's actually when you step into that unknown is where any and all things become possible. And I'm talking about spontaneous healing. I'm talking about a state of consciousness that is transcendent of the thinking mind. There's no theory in that. It's moment by moment having that direct awareness of inner stillness.
Yeah, it's where I think we are right now is this, even if I mean, my take on religion, I mean, I grew up in a United Church, and my experience with it was really positive. I feel like it was all very beneficial. The messages were really good. I have really no negative feelings around that. But I think what tends to happen as when I got out of Sunday school and grew up more and investigated things, what I find happens is it's like same thing. I would find certain teachings profoundly impactful, beautifully, like in whichever religious text you want to look at. And a lot of times what I think happens is it's like what the original teachings from these avatars that spoke these words, like whether it was Jesus or Buddha or whoever, I think what just happens is it's like they get interpreted as they get passed down by people that are not at the same level of consciousness as what they were originally spoken at. So they, it's like what's that game called with the broken telephone a little bit. It's like I think the messages get shifted and turned because they're not at that same level of consciousness, so they can't grasp the totality of the truth of the statement in the same way. So then it gets watered down a little bit, and then it doesn't mean quite the same thing, or it gets distorted. And then I think also then, human things around greed and control fit in, and then it can be used for different tools. What I love about where we are right now is it's like, regardless of what religion people have, and you don't even have to let go of your religion, but find the truth within your own religion. It's like what you're talking about is this really intimate connection that you get to have yourself with your God, with your source, whatever that might be. But it's a tangible knowing that we're all sort of, I feel like, is more available to us now than it probably ever has been. For whatever reason, it just feels like it's been bubbling up to a point where more and more people are able to have this type of a knowing because they're having an intimate relationship themselves with it.
Absolutely. And I can't, the word meditation simply means focus. So we can operate from the surface of our minds where we will be sort of distracted by the outer world. And I should also add, we've all been conditioned to sort of look outwardly to authority, to be told, when the truth is, there's the authority within, and that is the presence within, the highest self, source, God, whatever name you want to give it. Ultimately it's nameless because it has no form. But if you've, it's important to know, if you've had your fill, of the outer world and the suffering that comes with the egoic mind, know that there is a dimension within you that is transcendent of suffering. It's the inner being. When that is brought to the forefront of one's consciousness, that is where the truth is revealed. The truth is inner stillness. And once you tap into that, you will understand deeply what that means.
Beautiful. Julio, one other part around frequency. So frequency is talked about a lot. From your perspective, what does it mean when we talk about raising our frequency? Is this the same as raising our consciousness, or how do you sort of see it or perceive it?
Very, very similar. So imagine, when we come into this world, we take on the ego, and as we allow emotions and negative emotions and experiences to be accumulated, so what's not forgiven, what's not released, accumulates. So really, it's not so much that you have to raise your frequency, it's letting go of everything that's keeping your frequency from fully expanding and fully, because I say this often, enlightenment is only the beginning, and there are no limits to consciousness. So the more you just operate and live in that present moment, you really don't have to do anything, in a sense, to keep expanding and raise that frequency. It's automatic. It's like as the petals begin to open up, there's no limit. But if you want to, for example, use those positive affirmations that I mentioned, more like conscious thinking, that will assist in raising one's frequency. But really, it's letting go of that which you are not, and letting go of that which is truly not who you are. So it's coming back to self, the source, and just allowing that to express.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Julio. What you had mentioned with regards to meditation, simply being focused, and then your you're asking that rather than getting distracted by everything that is currently around us, to instead go within, implies that the answers to what it is that we seek is not even out there outside of us, but is within. How is that, how does that happen? How is it that, and how would it exactly, how would we know when we've touched on an answer within? And how does that then manifest itself within our world?
So we know we've tapped into it when we begin experiencing the clarity. So it's a shift from, and I can speak for myself, is I had a lot of questions in the year leading up to my shift. And when I made that shift into stillness, the clarity spoke to me. And that being in the conscious awareness of inner stillness, because even before my shift, I'd be in stillness and not realize it. So when you're consciously aware of the inner stillness, you are in that knowingness. You are now mind, body, and spirit completely aligned, completely aligned. And the soul or source within knows all that there is to know in the sense of wisdom, clarity, understanding. So you simply have an understanding, and how that impacts or how that affects the way we operate in this world is you now take conscious action. You're not operating through fear or doubt. You're no longer making choices, for example, seeking to be completed in a relationship because you realize you're already whole and complete, and now you're just seeking to share that wholeness and completeness with another. So when you operate through that dimension of inner stillness, you're operating through clarity, wisdom, understanding, and every spiritual faculty that you can imagine, whether it's conscious thinking, one's psychic abilities, you're now just allowing them to express. And you're essentially in that surrendered state. You're not really having to do anything. Things are happening to you and for you. There's no effort in that sense.
It makes me think of, that's beautiful. And there's so many parallels happening here. It makes me think of also what RJ said not too long ago with regards to a master only thinks about what it wants to create, thereby emphasizing, I think, as you have, the power of thought and the power of our focus and the power of our attention. And I have a question for you. Does Julio ever get rattled?
Do I ever get rattled?
Yes.
No, but I will say this. You will observe the rattling on the surface of the mind.
Huh.
So I'll give you a perfect example. You're driving and someone cuts you off. So you're in the moment, and oftentimes there's no reaction whatsoever because you realize that person is going through something that is causing them to behave that way. So it's that non-attachment and that understanding. And in those instances where there is a reaction that is temporary and momentarily, even with that, you realize it's the egoic mind. Again, it's on the surface. So you observe it. There's no reaction to it. And because this is the thing, and this is very important to understand, we're all one and we're all connected. And, we pick up on other people's energies and other people's emotions. I'm going to give a little secret. Just placing your attention on someone, you want to know what's on someone's mind? Just put your attention on them. If you're in stillness, you'll essentially read almost everything about that person or what they're experiencing. So you could pick up, so suddenly you put your focus on someone else, and now basically their energy is one with you. So you're experiencing all their frustration and insight. And it's being aware of that and then letting that die, realizing that when you're operating through stillness, you realize that's not you. That's simply the collective ego.
So interesting.
I again love it when you get the overlaps. You know, I've just finished doing this course. I'm doing another advanced training in it called biogeometry, and part of it is using sort of very calibrated pendulums to pick up specific wavelengths of energy and stuff like that. That it's all part of like Earth grid and all these different things. It's really fascinating, but a lot of it comes down to being very, very mindful of where you are putting your focus, because it will pick up on exactly what you are focusing, because you are now in resonance with whatever it is that your focus is stayed on. So it's getting out of your head, it's staying very focused on a specific thing in order to calibrate that specific thing. And it really brought home to me what you're talking about too, the importance of where we lay our attention, and that as soon as we put our attention on something, we are now in resonance with that. So for good or for not so good, right? Or for benefit or for not benefit. So to be very aware of where we are placing our focus.
Absolutely. And I would just add, just to touch upon that a bit more, when you are fully aligned and know who you are in terms of the inner stillness or the inner being, that inner being is unyielding to this world. So it is unmoved by it. So any skirmish that happens on the surface of the mind, whether something slips by or you pick it up from someone else, it's observing that. So that question, do I ever get razzled or shaken? The true self never does. It's unmoved. So just to offer some greater clarity to that.
All right, that in itself was awesome. I think that
Yeah.
covers so much for people. Do you want to?
One more question. Can you speak on empaths a little bit? Because I don't think we've ever actually spoken of.
Well, and
being
even the
empathetic.
term empaths, I think everybody has the
Empathic.
capacity for empathy.
Right.
Some people I think are more affected by it than others. Maybe. Is that what you're
Yeah,
wondering?
I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more of that. So when you're speaking of, when you're placing your attention on someone and you're picking up what it is that they're sensing and feeling and experiencing. I know that personally, I do that a lot, and especially if we go into areas where there's a lot of people and a lot going on, I oftentimes feel overwhelmed and I have to remove myself. So how is it that some people are more perceptive to or open to receiving other people's energies and picking up on energies? Would you, I don't know,
Or
I was
just
wondering.
more, or yeah, is it harder to handle it as it comes in, or what would cause the overwhelm, I guess, that takes place with it?
That's a great point, Jason. So it can be, from one perspective, a double-edged sword. So the closer you are to your inner being, the more centered you are, the more you're going to pick up on frequency, vibration. Everything around us is information. So you're not separate from the quantum field. It's within and without. So the closer, if I give my own sort of example, before I made the shift, I was incredibly sensitive to everything around me and the energy around me. And that created a lot of suffering because I did not know how to handle it or manage it. So empathic simply means someone who is highly sensitive. So the closer you are to your inner being, the more quiet you are inside, the more louder the outside world. If we, ultimately there is no outside world because it's all within our mind, but we have to use relativity here. Is you're just sensitive to it. So in order to manage that is to observe it, and then eventually you become clear whether is it the personal ego that is reacting, or are you simply picking up on other people's energy. And the way to manage that, if you're in a crowd, is you walk in and you're centered. So be centered. And then as energies begin to sort of appear, again, it goes back to, am I going to react to this, or am I going to bring awareness to it? The moment you bring awareness to it, you now diffuse it, because the ego can't feed on awareness. It actually finds it it's not palatable. So that's how you approach, big crowds or things like that. So the empath simply means you're sensitive.
Thank you for that.
That's interesting. You know, it's different, but it was what it kind of reminded me of as you were talking a little bit around the idea of speaking in public, and when that sort of really causes a lot of anxiety. I remember someone saying, well, where are you, what's sort of your focus around that? Are you worried about how you're going to be perceived by it, or are you focusing on what you're wanting to share or imbue the audience with? So different than what you were saying, but it made me think around the idea of the awareness that you're trying to focus on rather than are you going to be affected by it?
And just to touch upon what you said, you nailed it there, Jason, is being centered. So not allowing yourself to be distracted, being focused on what it is you have to do in the here and now, and not allowing the ego to slip through the back door and
Yeah.
sort of take you off your center.
Beautiful.
Awesome. One more last question, just because
You're going to be here for 3 hours, I think, Julio.
That's all right. We're
I'm gonna keep
family.
coming
It
at
doesn't
you with
matter.
one more question. Just because we talked about this with David Avocado Wolf in a previous episode, I want to touch on this
Yeah,
just so
around
that we
ego.
can understand ego within the context that is being described now. So when we spoke with David, he mentioned that, it's important to come back to the ego and express that within our world. And I think when he was speaking of ego, he was speaking of the individual expression of who we are, of the divine.
Almost more like a Freudian perspective on ego, id, superego, and I think that being more tied to the identity. And I think what he was getting at was the idea that we need to put more of our individuality into the world again. He used the word ego around that, I think, within that regard. So
How would you describe it, or how would you see it based on the context that you're speaking of it here?
I sense what he was trying to get at was you're trying to integrate. So how do you operate in this third dimensional reality with the ego and then with awareness? So that's that balancing act. So it's understanding what the ego is relative to you, but ultimately, one's sole purpose is to reconnect and remember or rejoin consciously with source energy within, and then operate from that knowingness, from that unconditional love, from that clarity and understanding. So it's a shift from being ego-centered and having the ego dominate one's consciousness to now operating transcendent of three-dimensional thinking and now operating through pure beingness. And then the ego, again, like I mentioned earlier, is in the orbit. So it's no longer dictating who and what you are. It's no longer, in control. You're now operating through source or the highest self and being guided by that. So it's a tremendous shift and a complete reversal in awareness.
Are we giving up anything? Are we giving up anything of value when we allow the ego to dissolve within this realm?
That's a great question. And I'll start with you sacrifice nothing. When you move beyond, as you grow spiritually, as a child, we play with toys, but as you outgrow the toys, what do? You lay them aside. So what we're giving up is the idea of separation and littleness and limitation for the expansive, powerful, life-changing, and miracle-producing reality of knowing who you are relative to source or God. I'd say that's a pretty good trade.
And Julio, you'd probably agree, but I feel like then this is where the importance of having spiritual experiences and the value of that comes in. Because I feel like if people have invested the time, effort, and energy and focus into meditation, time in nature, and I'd be interested to see what else you would suggest as well. And you have that feeling of expansion or or samadhi, or in the Western societies, transcendental experiences, then you can tangibly know what that feels like. But without those, it's hard to even understand or tangibly again know firsthand what it is that could be dissolved, or what it is that you're remembering, if you're allowing the ego to dissolve.
I'll start by saying it comes down to letting go of the oars and letting go of the fear, letting go of the doubt, letting go of the belief that you're separate, and bringing presence to the thinking mind, and then realizing, if I'm bringing presence to the thinking mind, is there one of us or two of us? One is always changing, past, future, and then there's that silent witness. So enlightenment, from one point of view, is so uncomplicated. It's simply bringing awareness to the thinking mind and then having that spontaneous realization, that epiphany, that I am the awareness experiencing the thinking mind, but understanding it's not who I am, and it's temporary and temporal, just like the physical body is temporary. So it's just simply becoming aware of the eternal within us and allowing that which is to reveal itself and to come to the forefront of our consciousness, where you now directly experience it. There's no, I love this quote from A Course in Miracles. There's no order of difficulty in any miracle. All expressions of love, essentially, or unconditional love, are maximal. So it's just getting out of the way. So it's awareness. Awareness is everything. And awareness doesn't require strain, and it doesn't require doing. It's just being present and trusting.
I love I love that you brought up the Course in Miracles. I was just trying to think of one of the quotes that you reminded me of was when they said, "Nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God." That one always, whenever I'm going through challenging parts, that will often replay in my head too. It helps me move back to a place of surrender.
It reminds you, if you want to quickly, cultivate faith and trust, which is a huge part of that surrender, briefly look back on the past and look at all the times that you've gone through sticky situations, or where you thought there's no way I'm going to get through this, and you did. A way was made. So looking back on my life, I realized Source, God, has never failed me. And how is Source or God going to fail me now with what what I desire? Because the desires I have are what Source desires for me. And it's not desire that is the source of suffering. It's the attachment of when is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? We're dealing with infinite intelligence. I can't even begin to describe it. It's unspeakable, and it knows how to deliver that which you desire. Just allow it.
Julie, I can't remember all of it right at the moment. After we had talked to you originally, we were saying that one a lot and we had it up, but what you had said probably was the most strongest prayer that you could say. It was around the idea of, my will is God's will and God's will is done. But how did the whole statement go?
All that I desire and the will of God are one. And my will is God's, and God's will is done. So you're basically, that surrender is simply saying, my will is yours. And so take over, essentially, because if you realize all of God is for you, that God is within, Source is within, that you're not separate. And Source has, your highest self has an amazing life prepared for you. But you have to get out of your way. As all powerful as Source is, we are the only ones stopping Source from expressing that life. That if we realized all things are possible, what would you put your attention on and your intentions to? Because it is. And when you're operating through that, you'd be amazed at what begins to manifest, especially with what we're going to be talking about shortly is, what began to manifest in my life 2 years ago. It was completely unexpected. I didn't have to try to make it happen. It happened to me.
One thing I want to mention about that too, around the idea of getting out of your own way and sort of surrender. Sometimes I think people take that and then they think, I don't need to do anything. I'm just leaving it over. And there's a bit of a passivity that can happen. I've talked about passivity a bit because I feel like this is a sneaky one that comes in sometimes when we're working with all this stuff. I think and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Julia, but from my perspective, what happens in the surrender is that then in that surrender, you allow yourself to be infused with your own personal instructions that are coming from source to then, through an inspired action, you can't help but move in a certain direction.
Absolutely. So, for example, my books, I had to write them. I couldn't just imagine them, to be created. So you want to take that inspired action, pay attention to the cues. It's not simply sitting back and doing nothing. You're actually taking empowered action, inspired action. So you do have to connect the quantum field with this 3D reality, and you connect it. Thoughts are powerful. Words are even more powerful because now we're talking about sound and vibration. And then action is actually moving the immaterial to the material.
Beautiful. One thing around free choice, because I think everything you've talked about really gives a lot for people to start to work with around really stepping into our own power, I think, in many ways. When it comes to, say, when we've been in, because we've seen this, when you're living in a world where sometimes some of your personal freedoms are being constricted from a certain perspective, how do you still then come back to a place of free choice within yourself in lieu of external circumstances causing some what would appear to be restrictions on your free will?
It's important to mention this. This was coming in just as you were finishing that. As long as we're operating through fear and doubt and uncertainty, you have ultimately no free choice. Because if you're aligning with that, what are you choosing? You're choosing fear, and you're operating that way, and you're taking action according to that, according to what the ego is planting in one's mind. So it's not until you make that shift to the fearless one inside you, to the inner being, and realize the illusion that there's an outside of authority, because there isn't. So that's when you become sovereign and you start breaking down, that connection to this false matrix, this false world. And it's until you take inspired action and you operate from fearlessness, not carelessness, fearlessness, that's when you operate from free choice. And freedom, liberation, is a state of mind. So one can be put in a prison, but if you are free internally, it's not really an experience because you're actually operating through that unbounded, limitless presence that's within.
That's so interesting, Julia. As you were saying that, I was picturing, the frequencies, almost like on a radio station, and ego and the matrix and the reality that we've agreed to is on a particular frequency of, let's say, 22.5. And as we start to operate on a different level, so let's say we opt to step into a place of sovereignty or clarity, or the exercises that you're speaking of, it actually catapults us to a different radio station. And though we see what's happening at the level of 22.5 on that frequency, we're actually choosing to operate on 97.9, for example. And it's like the rules that were actually within the realm of 22.5 eventually won't even touch or affect the higher frequency that we're stepping into solely actually as a catalyst of what is happening at 22.5.
That's a great point. And this is what, from the Bible, the new earth. So new earth is the dimension of inner stillness. When you look at the outer world through the clarity of no mind, through the clarity of inner stillness, you realize, and I'm not to go too deep, but you realize the world isn't even. Okay, so you realize the only reality is the reality of spirit, and this is a world of, manifestation and temporariness. Everything is always changing, if you notice, in the outer world, and nothing sort of stays forever. And this is sort of, I'm going to say, the world is like a learning where we learn to master ourselves once again. So we forget who we are. But when you operate through inner stillness, that's the new earth we're talking about. New earth is the kingdom within. So when you have that clarity, you now are seeing through oneness. That is the new earth. You're no longer seeing separation. And I can't underline this enough. That phrase, one person can make a difference. The power when you operate through inner stillness, the power and the transformative, grid shattering power, and behind it, you are now allowing source energy to express through you. You're now seeing the world as source sees it. So source is not worried about what's happening. The highest self knows and sees the illusion of it. So what we're seeing, when you look at the outer world and you see what's happening, we are witnessing the thrashings of a dying consciousness. And when something is dying, or an animal is dying, it becomes a little dangerous near the end. But there is nothing that can stop the will of source or the will of God. So regardless of how loud it gets, it's important to stay centered and to cultivate that faith and trust, because the power, I mean, again, it's unspeakable. It's truly unspeakable, the power that is within us when we allow it to express.
Yeah, and that's when we talked to Paul Selig, and he channels the guides. He talked about this is what he's talking about when he's talking about re-seeing through the upper room, through the upper accord. This is through the eyes of divinity, so that we see it all, and we see it for what it is, but we re-see it through that different level of consciousness, and then from that we make new choices on how we want to proceed from there. Through
Exactly.
that place, which I mean, it's again, I get goosebumps with it, because it's like, it's always so beautiful when you hear the message coming from very different people, connecting to it in a very real way, and it's worded differently, but it's all got the same
Same
flavors, and it's just so beautiful.
I think it's important to add this too, is it's not that when you're operating through this awareness, it's not that you're ignoring what's going on, because I've been taking action for the past 2 years, and it's just not operating through fear, because you realize the futility in being afraid. So fear is not going to change anything. Fear is what got us into this.
I'm
So
really glad you mentioned, sorry, yeah, carry on. I'm really glad you're mentioning around the idea of taking action, because this is something we've talked about too in many series around this idea. And because people a lot of times do feel like they're sitting waiting. Like I talked to a person a while ago, and their concern was just around, I'm just waiting to see what they're going to do next. I said, well, you're concerned about it because you're in alignment with that frequency. So it's like, so carry on with that as far as how to address that and what you mean by taking action.
yeah, so just to touch upon what you mentioned, so they're waiting for something else because they're focused on the outer world
Yeah.
instead of being within and being centered and having an understanding that what we're seeing is the awakening of humanity. We never change when things are comfortable. It will never happen. You have to, there literally has to be, from one point of view, almost like a threat, before you run back to source and say, I've had my fill of this. Show me, show me another way. Show me how to be still and how to be at peace, even though there are storms raging in the outer. So, taking conscious action. When I was out there over the past 2 years, attending protests, I did it to make a statement, to show, support. It wasn't out of fear. It was to simply take that quantum reality and bring it, and represent it in this manifested world. So again, it's important. You're not ignoring what's taking place. You're actually quite aware, but you're not reacting to it, because when you're reacting to it, you're now amplifying it. And instead, and I realized, the power that one person who has found the light within, the power it has to impact, a lot of people. So you understand there's no power in reaction. Everything that we've been conditioned to believe, that's been the false truth. That has been the illusion. So you're literally shattering, the matrix, and by being centered and in the present moment, and trust, faith, cultivating those, that's how you literally energetically break this apart.
Yeah, that's beautiful. They like the idea, don't accept or reject anything, but use it as information that are naturally arises within you and then moves you in a direction. We've talked about that lots in different ways. I know for us, certain things that transpired in the school system that we just didn't want our kids in that school system. So rather than fighting with trying to create something there, when ultimately that's not really what they want to do, it's still kind of moving in a certain direction. And so then was like, okay, well, what do we want? Let's just, and then literally within the focus of what we wanted, from that place that was inspired, it just showed up,
and it's actually much better than we had even initially imagined for it to be. So we share these stories because we want people to realize this is how to manifest our new world that you're speaking of. It's really through using whatever it is that is coming up that is not sitting so well, and opting for something different. Okay, how can we do this differently? What direction can we move into? And even posing it as questions, as we often do, oftentimes starts to bring up solutions in ways that we hadn't totally had figured out within our intellectual mind.
Yeah, like we mentioned to dear Danny, we did an interview with just the other day. We'll often play what if games. What if this or this or this, to kind of sort of softly play with it and just sort of explore it, and it's like nurse it a little bit until it eventually that creates like this big inspiration that arises, and then it moves forward from there.
I just want to add that example you gave regarding the school system and your choice, that's your example of free will.
Yeah.
Realizing that you have choices.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful thing, because in any constriction, it's like if everything kind of keeps moving, think of it like water. If you constrict something, it's going to bubble out somewhere else. So it's like you put pressure on something and it's going to open up into somewhere else. That's where you can move to, right? It's not like you're just going to stay. If you're going to stay in that one area, you're going to get squished and squished and squished. But if you kind of allow it to push you where you are going to be naturally moving to, then it opens up new possibilities.
Absolutely. When they said you can't do this, you can't do that, no problem. I will work out at home, no problem. I will watch movies. I have tons of DVDs, in my free time if I want to watch. So whatever they threw, I couldn't help but laugh, because there's no reality to it for me.
Yeah.